So that's it, our first React application. I know at the beginning it started off awful slow and it took us several sections just to get content on the screen, but I hope you've got a better understanding of how React works now. There's a couple concepts that I really want to draw your attention to here in Wrapup. First off, some of the really big things that we covered. First, the difference between a class-based component and a functional component. Remember, a class is used whenever we want to have the concept of state in our component. We can use functional components like our video list or our video list item whenever we have a simple component that just takes some number of properties and returns some amount of static JSX. Basically, nothing really changes with these. They're always the same. Functional components like this are super lightweight and super fast, also really easy to get started with. Just the amount of code that you have to write is dramatically less than a class-based component. We've got class, blah, 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 constructor, blah, blah, all this kind of crazy stuff going on. The next thing I want to talk about is state in general. State is super confusing, I admit it. It's also a little bit more challenging because we're using this class-based component here as opposed to kind of the more dated or legacy style of creating a React component, in which you might be familiar with if you've ever covered React before. We use the create class syntax. You might see it in some older examples. Create class did a little bit more clear job of initializing your state because there was a dedicated method for it called getInitialState. In a class-based component, however, we really set our state inside of the constructor. We don't get a special function to do that. So this extra divide in here, where in one place we're saying this.state.equals, but then everywhere else we're saying this.setState, starts to get a little bit confusing. Nonetheless, I think that we did some pretty solid examples in here, particularly with the search bar. Getting a grasp of how to wire up an input with state is really step number one on grasping how state works. The number one thing to be aware of with state is that whenever we change our state, the component instantly re-renders along with any children that this component contains as well. Finally, one of the last things I want to remind you about is using import statements and export statements. Our index file here had several import statements, and we required files in from the components directory. Whenever we have a file that we're trying to require in or import in that we wrote, we give a relative path reference, whereas wherever we use a library, we just give the name of the library. Finally, last thing I want to talk about is how often we used callbacks to manipulate our data here. In a React-only application, which is what we just built, we used callbacks twice, which for an application that only had 4 components total, well, that's kind of a hefty number of callbacks, right? In many Redux-themed applications, as we'll find out very shortly here, we much less frequently have callbacks like this. We're much less frequently passing down callbacks in kind of this really kind of confusing fashion in which we did it here. So I think that in later sections, as we start to move away from callbacks and start to use the full power of Redux, a lot of this stuff will start to get a little bit more clear. Nonetheless, do know that callbacks exist, and they're a great way to do parent-child communication without a lot of extra overhead. There actually is one last thing I want to mention. In this section, we've covered the topic of state, right, several times in different components, both in app and inside the search bar. One thing that I want to draw your attention to, and this is going to get very relevant as we start covering Redux, is that this is component level state. This component, app, and this component, search bar, both have their own state, and it solely belongs to them. Now we can pass callbacks, that kind of change the state, and we can pass data from the state to other components, but at the end of the day, whenever we change, say, search bar state using search state, it only triggers a change on search bar. It's a very localized form of state. That's going to kind of change a little bit in Redux, and we'll talk about it in an upcoming section about exactly how it's different. Just be aware that when we're talking about state here in React, it's very component level. When we start to talk about it in Redux, it's going to be more application level, so a much higher level of state. But again, we'll talk more about that in due time. I just want to draw your attention to it before we get there. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this application. Honestly, when I first built it, it came out much better than I was expecting. Obviously I was expecting a lot, but it came out pretty well, I think. In some regards, it's actually a lot easier to use than YouTube search because it's instantaneous. You can click the results right here on the right, and you can play the video instantly, as opposed to YouTube where you kind of get that full page load. This interface right here is almost a little bit faster than using YouTube, so it was really a pleasure to put together. All right, so with this review all done, let's get started on Redux in the next section.